thank you for having me. Really excited to be here. I have not been to Michigan since I was 10 years old for a wedding, so it's nice to properly experience it. I am a human-robot interaction researcher. I primarily focus on social robotics and interaction with robots through natural language and gestures. Today's talk is going to be a little bit weird, perhaps, or non-traditional. The topic of the talk might be a little bit different from the types of things you might normally see in your seminar series. In addition, it's going to be a little bit different because I'm going to be talking about my own research as opposed to that of my students primarily. And so I'd like to just briefly, I feel like I would be a bad advisor if I didn't briefly say something about my students. Right now in my, and this will give you a sense of the types of work my lab does. Right now, my lab has 6 grad students and postdocs who are working on tasks or on topics like design games, cognitively inspired models of robot working memory, augmented reality, and social justice oriented robotics pedagogy, cognitively inspired models of joint attention and language generation, robot co-design with survivors of domestic abuse, and improvisational theater inspired robot design. And then we also have currently about 15 undergrads working in the lab on topics like puppeteering, co-design of robots for unhoused communities, large language models for astronauts, models of mushroom cognition, etc. So pretty broad, but largely focused currently on language understanding and generation, both algorithmically, empirically, design focus, etc. Okay, this is my apology slide to my students again. Across all of this, though, we primarily focus on interactions with social robots that are used in domains like elder care, education, therapy, etc. And these robots are going to have a lot of power. Social robots are social agents, which are defined by their ability to take social actions in their environments. And social actions are actions which engage in human social power dynamics in order to manipulate human dispositions, which sounds a little scary. In HRI, when we're talking about manipulation, we're typically talking about benign things like persuading seniors to take their medicine, persuading kids to engage in educational activities, persuading people in therapy to perform exercises, and so forth. But yes, on the other hand, manipulating dispositions presents ethical risks in robotics as well. If you are not from the human-robot interaction community, one of maybe the most cited papers in the field is this paper from Paul Robot et al. At Georgia Tech, where they had people interact with a clearly malfunctioning robot. The building then floods with smoke. The robot says, "Follow me." And they show that every single participant in their experiment blindly followed the robot rather than leaving the building via exit signs, and so forth. So a lot of potential for robots to mislead people or for people to overtrust robots. And this could be used inadvertently or it could be intentionally misused. So our lab has shown, for example, that robots that simply ask clarification requests after ambiguous commands, if the command is morally unacceptable, regardless of the interpretation, just asking for clarification can actually lead people to say, well, maybe it is okay for the robot to perform one of these versions. Otherwise, why would it have asked for clarification? You could also think about ways that persuasion could be intentionally misused by companies to persuade you to buy products, etc. So robots overall have this substantial and worrying potential for social influence, and roboticists have a responsibility to wield that power responsibly. This is how we typically talk about power in social robotics. However, scholars like Katie Winkle have pointed out in her theory of feminist human-robot interaction that there are, of course, larger networks of power relationships that are important in robotics. You need to pay attention not just to the robot and its human user, but to people like the user's friends and family, institutions, the researchers, the funding agencies, et cetera, all of which embed complex power dynamics that have ethical implications. And she argues in her theory, which actually takes some inspiration from some of the things that you'll hear in this talk, we are collaborators, that we should be working to challenge inequitable power structures by doing things like rethinking binaries and hierarchies, embracing pluralism, taking a participatory approach, making labor visible, and so forth. And these are some types of approaches that we have been pursuing in our work. As one example that I've talked to some people about today, we have this work on the PeerBots project. This is PeerBots is a social robotics software nonprofit that builds teleoperation software that's used in special ed classes and therapy to allow care wizards to Wizard of Oz robots with kids. And we've collaborated with this organization in ways that reflect some of these principles, like exploring pluralism by decentering autonomy, working to make labor visible through like service blueprinting methods, challenging hierarchies by elevating the needs of novice care wizards, engaging in participatory design through need finding and other iterative participatory design methods. We also, in other elements of our work, we've explored co-design work, for example, with kids to understand their ethical concerns. I mentioned Naomi is doing co-design work with survivors of domestic abuse, and so forth. So these are principles that we are trying to embody in our work in hopes of pursuing a more ethical line of human-robot interaction research. However, to understand how and where we can effectively apply these feminist design principles, I argue that we should be considering the other types of power that roboticists wield beyond interpersonal power. So just to be clear, studying interpersonal power, super important, and I've heard about like exciting work that's been going on here at Michigan on studying interpersonal power. Our lab does a lot in this domain, but the premise of this talk is we should be exploring other types of power as well. So what other types of power do roboticists wield? The framework that I think that is most helpful for answering this question is the matrix of domination, which is a framework from Patricia Hill Collins and Black feminist thought, which lays out these other types and domains of power that are used in service of oppression, including cultural, disciplinary, and structural power. And this is the framework that I use to structure some of my theoretical work on matrix-guided technology power analysis, and sort of the guiding framework for my book that I have coming out in about a month, which is sort of the focus of this talk. Specifically within using the matrix of domination, my argument is that we should be working to analyze how the default power dynamics work in service of oppression within each of these domains, considering how technologies like robots are currently working to reinforce those dynamics, and explore the historical and social factors that are responsible for that current technological status quo, and use this to understand how we can determine how we could do better as robot designers. So what I'm going to do today is very briefly but quickly talk about how robots are reinforcing current systems of power in these other domains, and how we might design robots in ways that subvert rather than reinforce those existing dynamics. Okay, so first, cultural power. This is the ability to impact underlying cultural norms, biases, stereotypes, and assumptions that are used to justify oppression. And I'll start with a story. So I did my PhD, like Lionel said, in computer science and cognitive science at Tufts University. And while I was at Tufts, we would frequently go up to events at the Nerve Center, which is UMass Lowell's giant robot playground. We went up there a lot, and as I was writing my book and doing historical research for it, I kept reading things about Lowell, Massachusetts. I was like, I know Lowell. You know, I've been there a lot of times to go to this robotics center, and it got me thinking and wondering what used to be on this site before it was a robotics center. And it turns out, well, it was the foundry for the Lowell machine shop. Very exciting. Has anybody been to Lowell before? No, the history. Okay, one person. So if you don't know about Lowell, Massachusetts, this is actually really important. So Lowell in the 19th century was a mill town. It was one of the big manufacturing and industrial centers in the United States. which means that the foundry for the Lowell machine shop was where they were creating the equipment for the Lowell mills, which was processing 33 million person-hours of slave labor per year. That is, the Lowell machine shop was creating the technology that facilitated the United States slave economy. Or at least, that's what the Lowell machine shop did until 1863, when slavery was, necessary asterisk abolished nationwide. The Northeast found other sources of cotton, and eventually the mills were repurposed into things like robotics centers, eventually. As the industrial North in the United States was pivoting, the South was in crisis. And this is something that the matrix of domination is typically used to help us understand, right? So abolition of slavery wasn't just devastating the Southern slave economy, it was also changing the power structure. So in the structural domain, we would typically talk about the slave codes that were set up to structure society along the lines of enslavement. In the disciplinary domain, slave patrols were set up to enforce the slave codes. In the cultural domain, this concept of race was created to justify those slave codes, and so forth. And so the end of slavery posed an intense existential crisis among white men in the American South. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, why is Tom talking about this? Why is Tom going into this deep historical detail? Aren't we supposed to be talking about robots? So the reason why I'm talking about this, is both as an example of the matrix of domination, but also because this specific existential crisis was a key factor in shaping robot design and shaping how robotics evolved as a field. So this is a patent from 1868, maybe the first robotics patent in the United States. It is of the steam-powered man as pulling this cart. There's some things you might notice. The man is wearing a top hat, curly hair, smoking a pipe, has particular facial features. Literary scholars have argued that the reason why this patent looks the way it does is because it was based off of pop culture. It was modeled after the second most popular character in pop culture at the time, which was the character Zip Coon from minstrel shows. And it was basically designed in the image of this caricature from minstrel shows. The patent itself didn't necessarily catch on as an engineering product. However, it did directly impact early science fiction. A couple months after this patent came out, it directly inspired one of the cornerstones of early American science fiction, the Steam Man of the Prairies. And this is from the original cover, and you can see some of the parallels. If you haven't read this book, the premise is this white boy uses a black mechanical man to carry him and his friends westward. The boy ultimately blows up the mechanical man to slaughter some Native Americans. He steals the Native Americans' horses, returns home. Him and his friends are financially and sexually successful. I don't recommend it. Taylor Evans, literary scholar, has argued that the story has a clear message. It's that, well, the message that the story was trying to convey in 1868 was that white men could no longer master black slaves. What were they going to do? Well, they could instead master technology to violently expand westward. And the mechanical black slave was a symbol for this possible future where Southern white boys would maintain their hegemonic power. And again, critically, this is the first appearance in literature of what we might consider today as a robot, as this like sort of a mechanical, agentic entity. Again, probably most people have not read this story, but it had a massive impact on science fiction. It spawned one of the first early anthologies and genres of science fiction, which included works like Le Futur, which also probably most people have not read, but which is the story that popularized the word android. It was a story that used introduced this concept of an android as this mechanical woman in order to discuss concerns about the rise of women's suffrage in France. So at this time, there's sort of these three key works that shape science fiction going forward. There's The Steam Man of the Prairies, there's Le Futur, which built on it, and there's also Samuel Butler's Erewhon, which had these more sort of maybe Sidon-like biologically grown non-human machines that were used to explore fears of labor-related fears of losing power under changing technological and labor conditions. So these are the works that shaped how the concept of the robot would emerge and solidify in pop culture and engineering. And they helped to explain why Karl Čapek, when he wrote Rawson's Universal Robots, chose to use the word robot, which in Czech means slave or forced labor, to describe the machines in his story, because he was building on this past half century of wildly popular science fiction that was already essentially using this metaphor. RUR, of course, went on to inspire stories like I, Robot. Quick poll, who wrote the hit science fiction story I, Robot? No, it was Earl and Otto Binder who wrote this story, I, Robot, about this robot slave rising up and killing its master. But it's what inspired Asimov. Asimov, at age 19, read that story and said, it said that he read that story and decided he didn't want more robot stories about these robots rising up. So instead, he wrote these stories where the robots were mechanical and could be controlled, and in his words, in his stories, were given good, healthy slave complexes, and encoded these, what some people have called these computational slave complexes of his laws of robotics to keep the robotic slaves in line. Also, second pop quiz, who, and you might guess the trap at this point, who created Asimov's laws of robotics? Yeah, okay, all right. Yes, Asimov credits them actually to his editor, John Campbell, who, there used to be a John Campbell Award in science fiction, there is not anymore, because John Campbell was an apologist for slavery and argued that we should be bringing it back. So this is sort of the hidden history here behind where these laws of robotics came from. This, of course, this is science fiction, but this did feed into engineering. So Joseph Engelberger, for example, often called the father of robotics, talks about the ways that Asimov inspired him to get into robotics. He met the engineer at a cocktail party, and the apocryphal story is they discovered their mutual love of Asimov and decided to create a robotics company based off of it. But Engelberger, when he was asked what the role and purpose of his robots were, he said, since we can't have slaves or kick around black people anymore, the robot serves that purpose. Directly connecting what he was doing back to this image of robots as replacements for slaves. And something that I think is also interesting here is Engelberger saying this in the 50s, saying, we can't have slaves or kick around black people anymore, aligning himself with slaveholders from 100 years earlier in the United States. Of course, this isn't just Engelberger. Ruha Benjamin has this great example in her book, Race After Technology from 1957. Early popular science article about robots described them as, in 1863, Abe Lincoln freed the slaves, but by 1965, slavery will be back. We'll all have personal slaves again, only this time we won't fight a civil war over them. Again, describing them in relationship to slavery and positioning themselves in alignment with these former slaveholders. So what we essentially have is in the cultural imaginary of science fiction, in the technological imaginary of engineering, and at the sort of intersection of popular science, this shared vision of what robots were and what their purpose was, which I call the white patriarchal robot imaginary, which can be traced back to this early science fiction story and both the engineering and science fiction culture at the time. Something interesting we do see over this history is robots moving physically away from this image of black men while maintaining their status as slaves to white men. So the image changes. So like in I, Robot, it's no longer depicted in the story collection from Asimov. They're no longer depicted this way, and they are Asimov's robots do things like singing HMS Pinafore, Gilbert and Sullivan, like very white-coated behaviors, while maintaining the same sort of labor status. This is still pretty far in the past. What about robots today? Do today's robots still reflect in some ways this history? Yes. So today, in a couple different ways. Today's robots are expected to embody virtues that align with the status as slaves. They are often designed for the benefit of white men, and they're often designed with aesthetics that sometimes intentionally perpetuate stereotypes that benefit white men. In terms of virtues, Rob Sparrow, the philosopher, has described this as robots were supposed to have the same set of virtues, that is hardworking, obedient, servile, as slaves, and to perform the same set of tasks. And we still see this today in terms of maybe the metrics we use to evaluate robots. We also see this, though, in terms of the robot ethics literature. People may or may not be familiar with this. If you're in robot ethics, maybe you do, of this paper from Joanna Bryson from now 10, 15 years ago, explicitly arguing robots should be slaves. And Bryson now regrets this paper's title, but this shows that even people in robot ethics are explicitly arguing, continuing to argue, for using slavery as the appropriate metaphor for interpreting robotics. If we think about the intended beneficiaries of robots, we can look at how they are advertised to consumers. Jibo, if you're not in HRI, is a social robot that came out at about the same time as Alexa. Pour one out for Jibo. That's hard competition. If you look at how Jibo was advertised, some people have pointed out that in the original advertising videos, it was shown as sort of, with these very heteronormative white families. But also, there's a scene in the video where they say, and Jibo can also be a great wingman. And Jibo is shown basically helping his white male owner get dates. Maybe a weird choice, but and again, this is not necessarily the technologists, but it's the companies and how they are motivating and selling these robots and who they are trying to sell them to. And I think it says a lot about whose aspirations the robot was intended to advance. In fact, today we are still seeing robots being motivated as a way to return to slavery and related modes of servitude for the wealthy. Some of this is sort of explicit. When Tesla's new robot was first announced, there were a number of influencers on Twitter, especially from South Africa, who were explicitly positioning it as a replacement for black female domestic labor in South Africa. But I think it's also worth reflecting on the field's sometimes obsession with butlers and why people are so obsessed with robot butlers and the specific mode of labor that represents, and why this is such a touchstone for the field. Finally, we could think about the ways that stereotypes are embedded into today's robot aesthetics. If you look at humanoid robots, at least as of maybe 3 years ago, there are papers that analyze humanoid robot aesthetics in pop culture, in what's coming out of engineering labs, and what comes out of search results, and it's all the same. Essentially, at that time at least, humanoid robots tended to fall into one of two categories. They were either white and masculine when they were built for, quote, traditionally masculine domains, or to reflect how roboticists would like to see themselves, or as white and feminine in traditionally feminine domains like administration. This is also true for voice assistants and the accents that they tend to have, or when robots are built to be sexualized. This is the case for sex robots. This is also the case for robots like Isla. For anybody not familiar with Isla, what domain do you think this robot is built for? Space exploration. Yeah, so maybe not, so you might ask, so this is not, maybe a traditionally feminine domain, but you might ask, why is this robot built for space exploration given such clear, both feminine and female morphological characteristics? I took this picture. I asked the person who was demonstrating the robot why, and he said, well, we gave the robot a chest so we could fit more computer chips in. I don't think that's the correct. And in fact, it's not. I emailed one of the lead designers last year, and he said, I quote, "I can answer why we chose to leverage female sex and feminine gender cues for the appearance of the robot Isla. In short, it was deliberately a cheap trick to make our project survive." And he sent me the team's vision board where they had clustered all of the different, mostly hypersexualized images of feminine robots in popular culture. They drew what translates, it says no-go, and somewhere else there's German that translates into line of shame, around sex robots. and essentially tried to design the robot to be sexualized as a PR stunt without making it appear to be a literal sex robot. Very overt and intentional use of playing into the stereotypes even today. Okay, some caveats. This is what I've said so far, pretty limited to US and EU contexts. However, even outside of the United States and Europe, specifically white male aspirations are often playing a key role in shaping what robots look like and how they're deployed. I think the best example of this is the Enki robot. There's a great paper from Ana Romero Guevara on this from 2015. The Enki robot was deployed into South Korean English language classrooms. It has this white woman's face on it. The kids are told it's autonomous. It's not actually autonomous. It's remotely controlled by primarily Filipino women. And so what you have is these primarily Filipino women whose identity and labor are being erased as their facial expressions are being mapped onto this white woman's facial expressions in order to have a robot that in the South Korean context has a race and gender that locally is viewed as more appropriate for an English language teacher, which Guevara analyzes in terms of the history of American imperialism, both in the Philippines and in South Korea. You might say, though, like, what about robots in places like Japan? Robots, lots of humanoid robots in Japan, very clearly not white. This is true, but we see similar patterns. So if you look at the work from Hiroshi Ishiguro's lab, for example, on the one hand, you have robots like the Geminoid, which is designed, Hiroshi, the Geminoid, which is like the clearest possible example of a robot designed like in the image of its creator when it's supposed to reflect the characteristics of the creator. But we also have from the same lab the Erica robot, which the paper describing it says that they designed it by based off of images of 30 beautiful women so that the robot would appeal to everyone equally, where everyone is doing a lot of work, right? And says a lot of specifically who is included in the vision of who the robot is designed for and whose sexual aesthetics are sort of being baked into the robot's design. So similar patterns, but they manifest differently in that context. You might say, okay, lots of, and I'm talking specifically about interactive robots today, right? I'm not talking about like snake robots or undersea robots, right? But even lots of interactive robots today don't seem to embody visibly racialized or gendered characteristics, like Jibo, right, for example. You can probably think of lots of social robots that don't necessarily have clear physical morphological characteristics. However, again, we're talking about social robots. And as soon as a robot starts to talk, people are going to racialize and gender it based off of things like prosody, lexical choice, syntax, pragmatics, etc. People have tried to design agender voices for robots or genderless voices and largely have not been successful. In general, the more free of explicit identity cues people have made robots, the more people will latch onto whatever remaining cues there are in order to categorize the robot. So for language-capable robots, it might not be possible to design robots that are completely, are not subject to social categorization, which is sort of seems to be innate right now. So robots are designed in ways that are gendered and racialized. But do people actually apply human stereotypes to them? Yes. In my lab, we've done a lot of work on norm violation response. So how firmly robots should push back against people when people ask them to do like inappropriate things. And one of the things we found is that people care a lot about proportionality. And they want robots to be proportionately harsh. If you ask a robot to, I don't know, steal you some candy off somebody's desk, people don't want the robot to say, oh my God, you're horrible. How could you ask me to do that? Simultaneously, if you ask the robot to do something very serious, or if somebody says something like sexist, the robot's there, people don't want the robot to be just, sort of brush it off. So they want a proportional response. However, what we found is that if you look at what people consider appropriate, it's rife with gender norms, right? People, especially men, will downvote feminine-presenting robots that are shown rejecting commands. This is like overt sexism. And both men and women will downvote videos of robots rejecting commands that are coming from women. This is maybe like benevolent sexism. So yes, people are applying these human stereotypes and carrying them over into robotics. So robots are designed in ways that reflect and evoke these stereotypes. How do roboticists reinforce the stereotypes that are used to justify oppression? In general, what we have, at least in the United States, is predominantly white or white and Asian male robot designers building robots in service of those designers' values and in terms of those designers' aesthetics. This reinforced stereotypes about what robots are and what robots look like, stereotypes about who their designers are. You've probably made some assumptions about the characteristics of Isla's designers, for example. And it reinforces stereotypes about the humans that those robots are depicting and what types of humans are appropriate for different types of jobs in our labor market. All of which goes back and reinforces this and creates a reinforcing cycle. So what do we do? I would argue we can return to some of these principles from feminist human-robot interaction. Katie Winkle has done interesting work on rethinking binaries through cross-stereotypic design. So designing robots that overtly present visually, for example, as feminine in a Swedish context, but behave in ways that push back on Swedish gender norms. And she's gotten good results there. And we've also collaborated with her, as well as with researchers in Japan, to show that cross-stereotypic design can be an effective strategy across different cultures. An alternate approach would be rethinking binaries through agender design. I had a student, Mike Stolp-Smith, agender student in my HRI class a couple years ago in 2023, who, when we were talking about gender in robot design, said, well, Tom, there's more than just masculine robot, feminine robot, avoid gender entirely. And talked about the ways that non-binary people will sometimes identify as agender, as a separate gender identity, and talked about how genderless versus agender are different. They also talked also about the ways that HRI has paid probably little attention to transgender and non-binary perspectives in robotics. So we decided to talk to other trans and non-binary people to find out what they thought about robot design, and specifically about robots designed to have agender, to depict or perform agender identities. So Mike designed this robot using the MISTI and gave it a voice and name and pronouns that reflected this agender identity, recruited trans and non-binary participants, and overall found that, yes, through this approach, people perceive the robot not as genderless, but specifically as depicting this agender character. People were optimistic about the use of this design to avoid reinforcing patriarchal gender roles, to create opportunities for exposure to non-cis identities. But they also raised some concerns around dehumanization and rainbow capitalism. So the ways that companies might use this strategy as a PR stunt, or if all robots are designed to have this type of identity, then could that lead people to dehumanize actual agender people by sort of mentally associating them with robots? So this raised some interesting thoughts. Overall, then, we've got sort of different approaches we could take at different levels of depth. We could revise our designs away from, simply work to revise our designs so that they're less egregious. We could work to rethink whether all of our robots maybe need to be human-like and language capable. Maybe your Roomba doesn't need to talk to you. Or by identifying the history that led to the status quo of where we are today, we could think about how we could move forward in a way that avoids that status quo. For example, by working with different communities from first principles to design robots that meet their values, and pushing for more diversity in our robotics companies. Very briefly, I'll now talk about these other two domains. So disciplinary power is power over the rules of the game that manage oppression through the ways, for example, enforcement of racial and gendered logics. So something that has concerned our lab over the past couple of years is the rise of social robot APIs that have automated mechanisms for social categorization. So if you've used a Now or Pepper, for example, there's a function in it that tries to essentially play guess the gender and guesses the gender of the person that the robot is talking to. Specifically assigns a number between male and female, which are sex, not gender, but is described as gender categorization. And our argument is that robots that algorithmically sort people into these categories, either into binary gender categories or into specific racial categories, reinforce power structures in the disciplinary domain. And we can see this if we look at the categories that people are being sorted into. So in that case, it was male and female. If you look at other cases for gender, Morgan Klaus Scheuermann has this great paper from a couple years ago where he looked at race and gender categories in computer vision data sets. And in terms of gender, it was not good, right? Like one of the main computer vision data sets assigned everybody the gender of either male or attractive woman. Those are the two genders, apparently. But it was worse in terms of race. So in terms of race, for example, Microsoft's celebrity image data set classified all the celebrities into either Caucasian, Mongoloid, or Negroid, which are these like 19th century race pseudoscience categories. So Microsoft was sort of implicitly asserting through those labels in their computer vision data set that people today should continue to be sorted algorithmically into those categories, which is concerning on its own, but also as robots or AI models are deployed globally, we could view this as a form of colonialism that inflicts what Dan McKillen calls epistemic violence. We could ask, well, what are the historical root causes that explain this technological status quo? Simone Brown has this awesome book I recommend called Dark Matters, where she talks about computer vision models that classify people along these lines as falling into this longer history of biometric surveillance technologies that assign a category to somebody, make it visible, and make it difficult to challenge. So this includes things like slave brands, early non-computer databases, state driver's licenses that have a racial category on them. And she also applies that to AI models of face recognition. And I think we can, so there's an easy hop from that to robots that are using these models and the ways that they fit into this history. We can also see robots' disciplinary power through the ways that they directly enforce specific norms of behavior. So we could ask, what are the rules? And I had talked to some people today about moral cognition in robotics, and somebody asked, well, like, how do you decide if a robot is following moral norms? What norms are encoded? So we could ask, what are the rules or norms that roboticists are likely to encode in their robots, and how might that reinforce inequitable power structures? In general, what we have is, again, the same, like a relatively homogeneous population of robot designers designing robots in service of their own values. And in ways that can lead to encoding and reinforcing norms that lead specifically to racialized oppression. And the way that I will show this is to look at a specific context where social robots are used that I think is actually very pro-social, and consider how existing rules in those contexts are used in service of oppression along racialized lines. So some people have also asked me today about robots in education. Robots are increasingly being used in education in, I think, a lot of really helpful ways. However, people have also been developing educational robots that do things like check student IDs and attendance, check school uniforms, look out for disruptive behaviors. In some cases, this is important. So again, like identifying, if kids are being sexist, if the robot doesn't call it out, people are going to view that as the robot condoning it. But in general, these types of rule checking about like attendance, uniforms, behavior should make us nervous because of the effects those rules already have when they're enforced by humans. So in the United States, 200,000 students per year are referred to law enforcement for in-school behaviors, primarily truancy, uniform violations, and ostensibly disruptive behaviors. And Black and Indigenous students are disproportionately likely to have those activities deemed, inappropriate and subject to discipline than other students for the exact same behavior. So robots that are automatically detecting and reporting violations of these norms of sort of appropriate behavior risk reinforcing the school to prison pipeline. I would argue that these robots are essentially new Jim cobots, enforcers of the new Jim Crow from Alexander, and of the new Jim Crow as discussed by Ruha Benjamin. I'll also just mention, as a brief moment here, I've been collaborating over the past year with Salem Elsway, who is a historian of labor who did his PhD here at University of Michigan. And we've been talking, and it's been interesting the way how him from history and me from robotics have sort of, converged to the same perspective. So he sent me a copy of his dissertation where he has a very similar concept, but instead of saying new Jim cobots, he calls them Jim Crowbots. So interesting the way that multiple fields are converging on the same ideas. And I think that this is in part due to the philosophical foundations on which we've chosen to build our field. So most work in machine morality, algorithmic moral decision-making, is grounded in deontic norms and in general Kantian deontology. The idea that there are these universalizable rules of behavior that we can all agree should be forbidden, obligated, or permitted. As an example, you might think about Asimov's laws, which you already talked about, as problematic, as sort of generally fitting into this domain. But among, actual robot ethicists today, this is it's not the only, but it's the dominant approach. We don't talk a lot, though, about the context behind Kant's ideas of universal moral norms. Charles Mills, a philosopher, in his book, The Racial Contract, pointed out that at the same time that Kant was developing his contractarian political and moral philosophies, he was also developing his racial hierarchy, and Kant has been viewed as sort of the first race scientist. So the folks for whom Kant viewed, according to Mills, norms as being universally acceptable were the people at the top of his racial hierarchy. So we, the people like Kant, agreeing that these are the norms that everyone should follow, and then enforcing those norms on the people lower in the hierarchy. Maybe we would, but maybe we wouldn't have some of these problems today if we were working towards machine morality through a lens that didn't assume the same single set of universal moral norms. There are a variety of alternatives. People recently have been proposing approaches in care ethics, Ubuntu ethics, etc. In our lab, we've done a variety of work on Confucian role ethics, which I will not talk about for sake of time. But we've been approaching that in ways that I think can, again, embrace some of these same feminist principles. Overall, then, in both of these examples, we see that we, again, have a variety of approaches we could take. We could simply revise our designs from sort of overtly problematic categorization schemes and norms of behavior. We could more fundamentally rethink how our robots are acquiring information about social categorization or norms. Where do the norms come from? Where do the categories come from? Or if we look back at the history of biometric surveillance technologies, the histories of moral philosophies, maybe by examining those histories and considering alternate origin points we could have started from, we could come to new directions to move forward in the future. Finally, let me briefly talk about structural power, which might seem like the farthest away. The ability to influence societal institutions that are used to structure oppression. I argue that roboticists do wield structural power through their decisions of what institutions to collaborate with. This is something I'm a little bit outspoken on in the HRI community, but being concerned specifically about the rise of police robots. 3 years ago, for example, San Francisco's Board of Police Supervisors voted that they voted to allow police in San Francisco to kill people with robots. They explicitly voted as this is something that they wanted to allow. And so we could ask again, how did we get here? I will, again, for sake of time, skip past the history of policing. It all goes back to Ireland. But essentially, what we have is one branch of policing history that goes through the UK, their use of police to control, to quell political protests and then labor unrest. And then in the United States, policing emerging originally from slave patrols and then combining with that strand of policing to create the first Northeast police departments. And then in the American South, police departments after the end of slave patrols. This history of which then informs how police were used to respond to protests and unrest, and the way that military equipment began to transfer to police departments through programs like the 1033 program. This is how police departments originally started acquiring robots. But today, of course, police are increasingly acquiring robots through other means. We all love the dancing dog robot Spot, although the primary purchaser of this robot from Boston Dynamics is apparently police departments. And we can think today then about how police, as they are acquiring these robots that are now increasingly being built for them by roboticists, are using those. Dhruv Maratra has a fantastic article in Wired from last year about Chula Vista, California, near San Diego, where drones are being flown primarily over Latinx and working class neighborhoods so frequently that residents are being hospitalized due to the strain, the auditory strain of the constant surveillance. I think that roboticists' abilities to support or subvert police legitimacy demonstrates our ability to wield structural power, that is, to influence the societal institutions that are used to structure oppression. So as a final point, I ask, similarly to the other domains of power, what might it look like to revise, rethink, and rip up the status quo with respect to structural power? That is, what steps might we take towards an abolitionist robotics? This might, at the basic level, this might mean revising our approach towards policing. Shortly after the George Floyd protests, myself and several other roboticists in Colorado started a petition campaign where we got a little over 100 roboticists to agree not to collaborate with the police. Recently, I've been thinking about ways we might go beyond just, internal petition efforts. What are ways that robots might be designed to oppose or disrupt policing? That would be either robots that are private by design or robots that enable surveillance, that is, essentially the watching of people in power by people who are traditionally disempowered. My lab has also recently been doing work with unhoused populations and unhoused survivors of domestic abuse to sort of rethink what the orientation is between robots and communities that are traditionally over-policed. And finally, if we look at that history of policing and understand how we got where we are today societally with respect to these societal institutions, it suggests that maybe we should be looking at approaches that move beyond policing and prison systems, and maybe we should be, as roboticists, building alternative solutions to societal problems that don't require working with those institutions. Okay. I will stop there at 4:52. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.